Hi, class. Welcome to week 10, where we do the second half of our book, In Search of Respect, Selling Crack in El Barrio. Um, uh, Last week, I provided a video lecture on the first five chapters, and you read the introduction, chapter one, Violating Apartheid in the United States. Two, the street history of El Barrio. Three, crack house management, addiction, discipline, and dignity. And four, going legit, disrespect and resistance at the workplace. So I lectured a little bit on that last week, and we had a very good discussion board based upon those readings next week. Very impressive comments, thoughts, analysis. You provided a chapter summary of each chapter, a major takeaway, and then you talked a little bit about some of your own views and critiques on this. And so, especially how the author was able to use the sociological imagination in order to understand what's going on with crime and drugs in the inner city, where the author critiques a lot of the mainstream criminological and sociological theories to explain crime. And he does so very well, I believe, using the sociological imagination, linking, showing that intimate relationship between how structural issues cause so many personal troubles for people who are left on their own to fend for themselves. And in doing so, they come up with creative, even if self destructive, solutions to their collectively experienced structural problems of poverty, marginalization, social exclusion, and apartheid. And so the author in these first few chapters really lays all of that out. This next part has more to do with some of the consequences to all of this. So, chapter five, school days, learning to be a better criminal. And having been a teacher in New York City and having also worked as a teacher in a criminal justice system, in particular in juvenile jails, as I alluded to in my last lecture, you can certainly see how growing up in a lot of these public schools in New York, and in some of these in these kind of conditions within the schools can actually cause so much discouragement, especially how schools today use all these forms of standardization and rubrics, which is a mind numbing. It's almost no longer education; it's a rubrication. And so, if you think what education is supposed to be, it's supposed to be about empowerment. It's supposed to be about self actualization. It's supposed to be about self transcendence. It's about learning how to discover yourself so you can think independently, think autonomously, and make decisions that can empower you, your family, your community, your people. It allows you to spread your wings and become something more. So it's an intellectual task. It's a creative task. It's a self-discovery, self-transcendence, and self-actualization. Um, but we've taken education and we've rationalized it, standardized it, stupefied it. And now so many people are educated in the same way that we make hamburgers at a fast food joint, through an assembly line, through rationalistic procedures of conformity and rationality, which stifles the mind, it stifles creativity, it stifles individual progress, it stifles self transcendence. It does anything but empower people. And it traps people into this rubric iron cage that stunts the growth of their brain, their mind, their being, their intelligence. And so those people that don't conform to this dehumanizing educational system that we've created in the United States and its crippling standardization and uniformity, homogeneity, and its rubricness, those people who don't conform to this end up being excluded, discouraged, and negatively labeled as problem people, future criminals, etc. And so all this goes a long way. This dehumanizing educational experience is just of the part of the story, the narrative of how many of these young women and men became socially excluded from our mainstream institutions that provide power, resources, dignity, and respect. And so pay attention to this part, school days, uh, learning to be a better criminal. And as you well know, I have structured guided questions throughout each chapter. And so make sure that as you read along the book, that you follow the questions and guidelines that I think are most important, that I think that ask you to um, talk to the author, engage with the author, debate the author as you're reading. Reading is not supposed to be a passive behavior, but a highly active one where we're questioning the author, we're examining and analyzing what the author says, we're trying to critique the author, find holes and faults in the argument um, in order for us to better our own thinking. And so it becomes very important. Um, Chapter 6, I think, is very important because it brings up gender lines on the street and redrawing of the gender lines. And certainly as the criminal war on drugs and the so-called get tough on crime policies increase, especially at the hands of really both Democrats and Republicans, we see a more system of oppression used against the most vulnerable members of our society. And this whole fictitious war on drugs that was used to criminalize so many fellow Americans, largely just simply for social control and for profit. How it's put so many of our brothers in rotting and languishing in jails and prisons throughout this country. Of course, the United States is the largest penal colony in the world, with perhaps the most oppressive criminal, should be called injustice system that the world has ever known. And so, with so many of our brothers, uh, fellow Americans, languishing in prisons, largely for non-violent offenses, um, we see a lot of women who have to take on the more patriarchal roles of the streets, and so many men are locked away in prisons. And so the author talks about this redrawing of the gender line on the streets. I think is very important, especially for any critical feminist gender studies. So I highly recommend you pay attention to that book and follow the questions that I provided in my guidelines for the book. Then chapter 7, families and children in pain, talk about, in one sense, we have this kind of, romantic liberaling of others who, where more marginalized people find creative solutions to the problems of social exclusion and problems dealing with structural contradictions. Um, but who does this impact? So many family and friends. And so while we can, to some extent, celebrate people that find these creative solutions to overcome their collectively experienced problems, on the other hand, these are often self-destructive. And where the overwhelming vast majority of people that live in apartheid and under conditions of exclusion, the vast majority are law-abiding and conforming. The devastation of the informal economy with things like crack cocaine, even though most people have nothing to do with it, ends up impacting the entire community and leading to so much human suffering that could have been avoided if these types of drugs were never criminalized in the first place. And that drug addiction rather, was considered a mental health issue, like it was for cocaine users, rather than criminalized, like it was for crack users. And of course, that's because cocaine was looked at, it had this symbolic meaning of the caviar, of the bourgeois, it was the elite people in the swank jazz clubs, drinking Sazeracs, that were, snorting lines of cocaine. It showed social status, power, success, upward mobility, coolness. Right? Um, But crack symbolically meant something else. It became symbolically associated with being a thug, criminal, violent, aggressive. And so it was criminalized in a very oppressive type of way that ended up destroying so many lives of our brothers and sisters in the inner city, while the wealthier doing cocaine made of the same cacao. Uh, so many of them ended up in uh, dealing with mental health as a mental health issue, but the poorer you are, it became criminalized. And so, and this has real impacts for so many of our brothers and sisters in the inner city. And so that chapter, Families and Children in Pain, talk about this. I think is very important. Then chapter 8, Vulnerable Fathers. Again, more of an extension of this, this type of the kind of pain that it causes for so many people, especially people trying to provide for their families. They find themselves, after these four generations from successful business people, and because of American political and economic interference in their country that destabilized and destroyed their countries and didn't leave them with a chance to provide a livelihood, had to force their migration to an unknown foreign country where they had to make a way while being shoved in ghettos in Harlem and in the Bronx. And how many of these fathers wanted to go legit, they wanted to be educated, they want, but their exclusion opened up opportunities for success in the illicit informal economy. And that conclusion is also very important to read as well. And I have important questions within that conclusion that I hope that you look at as well. So, I asked some questions like, do you agree with the author that the United States lacks the political will to address poverty? Um, and that's a very good argument to make. No matter who's in power, it seems like both our Democrat and Republican parties have abandoned the American people, and they only serve the corporate elite, the richest billionaires who write social policy and make social policy, that have left people like you and I, the American people, disenfranchised from the decision-making process. And so what we see is increased debt, increased poverty, endless wars. And we see the CARES Act, which was the largest upward transfer of wealth in human history. We see while most of us became poor during COVID, we see that our elite, the billionaires, became exponentially richer while poverty exponentially increased. And so both ruling parties, the Democrat and the Republican parties, are corporate parties that have no real interest in ending poverty or alleviating any suffering. Um, and so I ask you, how does one work to help eliminate poverty in the United States? What are some structural solutions to poverty, inequality, and marginalization? Are these solutions possible? Because this is exactly what the book deals with. And so we want to start thinking about, remember, the point is not simply to interpret and understand the world, but to change the world. And so in your final paper for this class, I'm going to ask that you actually make some policy recommendations on how we can end crime, and hopefully without prisons and police, um, because prisons and police has never done anything to ameliorate the problem of street crime in our society. And that's because street crime is not the result of personal troubles, but rather is a result of structural issues. There's something sick in the institutional arrangements of our society that causes crime and needs to be dealt with at a structural level. And we also have to look at, can we safely ignore the drug hysteria? But if you look at the drug hysteria, was really made up during the Nixon administration, where the war on drugs was created to criminalize Black people, in particular, Black civil rights leaders, so that the American government can murder them and assassinate them and imprison them for nonviolent offenses, thereby destroying the Black community of its leadership and keeping them warehoused in hyper-segregated ghettos. It was also used to punish middle-class Black people, white people, women, men, everything. Was used to criminalize people fighting for environmental rights, animal rights, workers' rights, fighting against the war. the right to unionize, etc. And so the war on drugs was really used as a measure of social control, and it became very profitable at a time when drugs was not a problem in American society. And a lot of people would argue that we should decriminalize all drugs, and that if the conditions of anomie, that is, feelings of isolation, meaninglessness, exclusion, if those things bring about the need for people to bond to something like drugs because they can no longer bond with their community or family. Um, um, if those are the conditions that create drug addiction, then putting people in prison only exacerbates the problems of drug addiction in our society. People need love, family, community, support, connectedness, meaning, bonding. And they do that with family, friends, community. And when they can't bond with family, friends, community, they bond with, Instagram or pornography or drugs. And so, if we really want to solve the problem of drugs in our society, putting people in prisons that only exacerbates feelings of anomie will never solve the problem of drugs. Rather, is to create a healthier society, to create the social conditions in which people find connection and meaning and bonding with their family, friends, community, and interpersonal relationships. And then can we really attack the problems of crime and drug addiction. So hopefully these are things that you'll be thinking about carefully um, as you read this book and looking at the questions that I asked you to consider in my reading guide provided to you. Okay, and then we will have a discussion board, not too dissimilar. Will you also give a brief summary and major takeaway of chapter 5, 6, 7, 8, 9? Is much better if on your discussion post you put chapter 5, title, brief summary, and then takeaway. Chapter 6, title, brief summary, takeaway. Chapter 7, all the way to chapter 9, the conclusion, brief summary, takeaway. I like that type of organization. A lot of you did, but not everybody. And then I have two other questions for you if you agree with the author that the U.S. lacks the political will to address poverty. So make sure you answer every part of that prompt. And then part two, after considering public policy debates on poverty and the so-called drug problem, critique for or against the author's solutions to eliminate poverty. What public policy proposals would you suggest? And so I look forward to reading your post there. So be critical, put on that critical sociological criminological cap, use that sociological imagination, and let's try to think in new and creative ways with that sociological imagination to solve the problems of crime in our society. So thank you very much. Next week, I'm going to hold extended office hours, and so feel free to meet with me then. So thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you in discussion post. Next week, we're going to talk about the age of mass incarceration, which I think will be very interesting. Thank you and take care.